Psalm 138 is the first of a group of 8 psalms that brings us almost to the end of the Psalter. And while there's no specific historical context given by way of a title, as we have sometimes found with some of the earlier psalms of David in the book of Psalms, there is considerable agreement among the reliable commentators that this particular psalm was probably penned by David in response to the promise that God made to him, which is recorded in 2 Samuel 7. When God says, quote, "I will make for you a great name, like the name of the great ones of the earth, and, quote, your throne shall be established forever." Now that would make sense in the light, for example, of verse 2 of this psalm, and especially verse 8. It would hardly be surprising, given the staggering nature of God's promise to him, and given that David was a songwriter and a composer. It would hardly be surprising if, as well as his immediate response to God, which is recorded for us in 2 Samuel 7, he also later, after more reflection, wrote this great hymn of praise to celebrate this amazing event. Now, there are a couple of interpretative puzzles in this psalm that we just need to note because they do affect our understanding of the psalm, but we can't delve into them too deeply. In verse 1, David speaks about, as the ESV puts it, giving thanks to God, quote, before the gods. And the problem is caused by the fact that the word for gods, Elohim, can mean Yahweh, the true and living God. It can mean gods with a small g. It can mean angels, and it can mean earthly rulers. My own hunch is that here it refers to the latter, to earthly rulers and kings, which are also mentioned in verse 4, though a different word is used there. Then there's an enigmatic expression at the end of verse 2, rendered by the ESV as, "You have exalted above all things your name and your word." In the original Hebrew, this verse literally reads, "You have exalted your word above all your name," which sounds a little puzzling, since God's name is the highest of all things. Now, I don't claim to know the answer to this problem, but I do think that the conclusion reached at by James Knowlton, who expresses it like this: "In fulfilling thy word, thou hast magnified thy name above all things." I suspect that's probably correct. You see, God has just made the most astonishing, jaw-dropping, mind-blowing promise to David, a mere mortal. A promise like no other made by God to anyone, namely that David's household, his dynasty, would last forever. And David is saying in response that in keeping his own word, God is also exalting, magnifying his glorious name and reputation. So let's look at the psalm as we have it and notice 3 parts. First of all, in verses 1 to 3, we have answered prayer. David is going to give thanks before the kings and rulers of the surrounding nations because God has answered his prayer as an expression of his steadfast love and his faithfulness. Now, if our context for this psalm is correct, and the more I reflect on it, the more I am sure it is, this remarkable promise from God made to David was an answer to prayer. Now, I don't know exactly, precisely what David had prayed for, but it would seem that he had prayed that his royal dynasty would be established and prolonged, at least for a long period. And God said yes, and probably in a way that was exceeding abundantly above all that David had asked or even thought. Now, just in case you think I have suddenly taken leave of my senses and gone off into some flight of interpretative fancy, this thought is actually backed up by Psalm 21, verses 2 and 4, and Psalm 61, verse 5. And here's a quick lesson for us. David says in verse 3 that the fact that God has answered his bold prayer has strengthened and emboldened him. Isn't that what answered prayer should do? Increase our faith, encourage us to pray bigger, bolder prayers. Then in verses 4 to 6, there is anticipated praise. And this helps us understand something of David's motives in asking for a long-lasting dynasty. He wants it as an act of witness to the faithfulness of God, so that the surrounding pagan nations would look on in amazement and come to the only possible conclusion that God, Yahweh, is the true God, and therefore they would bow down and worship him. And then in verses 7 and 8, we have the thought of an accomplished purpose. As well as contemplating the long future that God has promised David's royal family, David has still got to get on with living and ruling in the here and now, with all its challenges and dangers. But he does so confident that God can be totally relied on to keep his promises, and that God will fulfill his purpose for him, as promised. I just want to make two different applications from this psalm. First, to ourselves. Obviously, I assume we haven't prayed for a long-lasting dynasty and kingdom, etc. But there are some points of connection for us here. First, like David, we have been chosen by God for his purposes. Second, he will accomplish his purposes in us. Paul says in the New Testament, he who has begun a good work in us will bring it to completion. Of that, we can be absolutely certain. Our lasting the course is guaranteed because it doesn't depend on us, but on him. And thirdly, in the meantime, in the minefield we walk through every day of our lives, we too need his ever-present help. And we need to pray with David of old, do not forsake me. But then, what we must notice about this psalm, and have already hinted at, is that this isn't a selfish, egotistical vision of David about his own greatness. This is so much bigger than that. You see, David is looking forward to the coming of King David's greater son, who will indeed sit on the throne forever, and before whom one day all the kings of the earth shall bow down and worship, as said in verse 4. See, this is a messianic psalm. It's more about Jesus than David. And what a great day that will be when the kings of the earth join together with God's people in praising the Lord.